Once upon a time, in old Japan, there was a Buddhist monk named Zenshi. Zenshi was well known at the temple where he lived because of his nose. It was about 5 or 6 inches long, and it hung down his face from his upper lip to the bottom of his chin. It was fat at the top and fat at the bottom, and looked like a long sausage, which hung off his face and swung from side to side. Zenshi was over 50 years old, and throughout his time at the temple, he had suffered constantly because of his nose. This made it very difficult to focus on meditation and chanting sutras, which were the roles of a Buddhist monk like him. There were 2 reasons Zenshi found his nose so hard to bear. Firstly, its length bothered him in everyday life. For example, he could never eat dinner alone. If he ate alone, his nose would fall into his bowl of porridge. So he had to have an apprentice sit across from him, and as he ate, hold up his nose with a small piece of wood. Naturally, this was very bothersome for both Zenshi and the apprentice who held his nose. One time, one of the younger boys was holding his nose and sneezed. This caused him to drop Zenshi's nose into the bowl, sending porridge all over his face and the floor. This incident was so funny to all the monks that it spread far and wide, and people even talked about it in the capital. However, this was not the main reason why Zenshi hated his nose. The main reason was that he was vain, and his nose was terribly ugly. People in the temple said that he was so ugly that no woman would ever want to be his wife. Some even thought that he became a monk because he knew he would never find a wife. Some even thought that he became a monk because he knew he would never find a wife. This was not true, but it hurt Zenshi to hear it anyway. He had a delicate personality and a huge vanity. Zenshi tried and tried to find a solution to his problem. When he was alone, he sat in front of a mirror and looked at himself from many angles. He tried desperately to find an angle which made his nose look smaller, but this just made him more anxious. So, he tried pushing and pulling at his nose, but if anything, it made his nose look bigger. Every now and then, he would repeat this activity until eventually he got sick of it and hid the mirror inside a box so that he could go back to chanting sutras. Another thing he tried was to look for someone else with the same problem. Next to the temple there was a bathhouse, and every day many monks went there to bathe. Zenshi would sit outside the bathhouse, watching people come and go, looking especially at their noses. There were big noses, there were small noses. There were short noses, there were long noses. There were flat noses, there were hooked noses. But there were no noses as big, as long, or as fat as Zenshi's. Zenshi even searched in Buddhist texts and history books for someone with a similar nose, but there were none there either. The longer Zenchi looked for a nose like his, the sadder he became. He was sometimes so anxious that in the middle of a conversation with another monk, he would stop to touch his nose, as he thought the other person was judging him for it. One day in autumn, Zenchi heard from an apprentice about a monk in China who had managed to make his nose smaller. His operation had been so successful that he was now a monk at the biggest temple in the country. Naturally, Zenchi pretended to be disinterested, but secretly he decided he would try out this method. After dinner, he casually asked the apprentice what the precise steps of the method were. The apprentice told him and said Zenchi should try it and that he would be happy to help him with the operation. Zenchi was overjoyed and said yes. The operation was simple: boil the nose in water and have somebody else crush it with their feet. So Zenchi went to the bathhouse and collected a bucket of boiling water. He was worried that if he dipped his nose in, the steam would burn his face. So he cut a hole in a plate and put it on top of the bucket so that only his nose would be dipped inside the water. "Ready, Zenchi?" said the apprentice. "Ready," said Zenchi. He took a deep breath and put his nose inside the bucket. It was very hot, but it did not hurt. Instead, his nose felt itchy, like many small insects had bitten it. Zenchi moved away from the bucket and lay down on the floor, his nose still steaming. The apprentice stamped on the nose with all his strength. Once again, it did not hurt. In fact, because his nose was itchy, it was a pleasant sensation. The apprentice looked very sorry for what he was doing. However, he kept stamping and stamping, crushing the nose beneath his feet. Zenchi's nose started to crack open, and small lumps fell out that looked like pieces of grain. The apprentice said that they were supposed to collect these, so he took a bag and collected up the pieces of Zenchi's nose. Zenchi felt anxious because a part of his body was being treated like a common object, but he said nothing. For the final step, the apprentice took a wooden spoon and scooped the fat out of Zenchi's nose. This part was the strangest, and he felt a bit sick as he watched the fat be taken out of his nose. 4 big spoonfuls came out and were placed into a small bowl. After being boiled, crushed, and emptied, Zenchi's nose was indeed smaller. The apprentice brought him a mirror, and he spent a long time examining his new nose. It was still hooked, but only 2 inches long. It had bright red scars from where it had been crushed by the apprentice, but already they were fading. Zenkai was confident that nobody could laugh at it because it was now a normal-sized nose. What he did worry was that the change would not be permanent. As he was chanting sutras, reading texts, and eating his meals that day, he would from time to time feel his nose. Each time he found that it was as before, well above his upper lip and not hanging down to his chin. When he went to bed, he worried that he would wake up and find it was all a dream. But when the sun rose the next day, he felt his nose and it was still small. He was overjoyed. He had never been so happy in his entire life. A few days later, though, his joy began to fade. It was strange. As he walked around the temple, people looked at him with judging eyes, and while before they had made an effort to avoid looking at his nose, now they stared openly at it. When he walked into the dining hall, the other monks, including the apprentice, who dropped his nose in the porridge, looked down suddenly. They had clearly been talking about him, and were trying not to laugh. Everywhere he went, people laughed behind his back. At first, Zenshi tried to convince himself that this was an unrelated issue. But eventually he had to admit that it was related to his change in appearance. Of course, many people had laughed behind his back before, but the way they laughed now was much crueler. Apparently, his short nose was much funnier than his long nose had ever been. Zenshi fell into a deep depression. He regretted changing his nose and wished he could have his old, long nose back. Of course, he could share his troubles with nobody because nobody understood his problem. He started to wonder if he should trick someone else into changing their nose just so he could have a companion in misery. Zenshi's vanity was now obvious to all the other monks in the temple. He became bitter and made mean comments to those around him. The apprentice who had helped him shorten his nose told him that he would be punished for his sin of treating people badly instead of spreading the word of Buddha. This made Zenshi feel even worse, and as a result he became even crueler. One day, Zenshi heard shouting and went outside to see what was happening. One of the apprentices was chasing a dog with a piece of wood, shouting, "I'll hit you with my nose. I'll hit you with my nose." Zenshi grabbed the piece of wood from him and hit him in the face. Then he realized it was the wood that was used to hold up his nose when he ate porridge before his operation. He dropped it, feeling sick, and ran away. That night, Zenshi felt so awful about his nose that he could hardly sleep. It was a cold night, and his nose itched. When he touched it, it was wet and swollen. He thought he had a fever and tried to go to sleep. The next morning, it was a beautiful, bright day. Zenshi got up and went to sniff the flowers. That was when he noticed something different. He felt something familiar. He lifted his hand up to his nose. It was about 5 or 6 inches long, and it hung down his face, from his upper lip to the bottom of his chin. His old nose was back. Zenshi felt a great relief. He felt just as happy as he had when his nose was shortened before. As the wind blew his nose from side to side, he felt sure that nobody would laugh at him anymore.